The country, being threatened with the Stone Age, once ruled roughly 40 to 45% of the entire human race. Here, in the heart of what is now Iran, an empire absorbed Babylon, Egypt, and Anatolia without burning a single temple. Which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone who learned their world history from a Western textbook. This is the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world ever built, and the most misunderstood document it left behind. This is no history. Pick up any popular history of ancient Persia and you'll find the same claim within the first few pages. The Cyrus Cylinder, the world's first human rights charter. The United Nations has a replica in its New York headquarters. American politicians have cited it. Iranian diplomats have cited it. It's one of those facts that crosses every ideological border, and when you see the object itself, the story feels right. It's a baked clay tube, smaller than a water bottle, ochre-colored, covered in dense cuneiform script, 2,600 years old and still legible. It was unearthed in Babylon in 1879, a British museum excavation. And when scholars translated it, they found something genuinely remarkable. Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II, had recorded his conquest of Babylon and then described what he did next. He returned displaced peoples to their homelands. He allowed conquered populations to keep their gods, their temples, their local customs. He freed those held in forced servitude under Babylonian rule. Jewish exiles, among others, were permitted to return to Jerusalem. This is not legend. The Hebrew Bible corroborates it. The Book of Ezra records Cyrus's edict. Archaeology supports the broad outlines. The consensus among historians is that these events happened. So the myth isn't that Cyrus did these things. He did. The myth is what we call it. Here's where the story gets more interesting and more honest. The Cyrus Cylinder does not articulate universal rights. It doesn't say all people are equal. It doesn't describe freedom as a principle. What it does is something far more specific and far more Mesopotamian. It follows a template. Babylonian kings before Cyrus wrote nearly identical inscriptions when they came to power. The formula was standard. New king arrives, old king was wicked, new king restores order, gods are pleased. Cyrus used the same political language his predecessors had used for centuries, but he meant it, and he had the empire to back it up. Historians classify the cylinder as royal legitimization propaganda, not because it's dishonest, but because that's what the genre is. Cyrus was telling Babylon, I am your rightful ruler. Your gods chose me. Your people are safe. The Library of Congress exhibition on Persian writing puts it plainly. Some experts see it as the first human rights document. Others see it as a primary document of federal governance. Both interpretations are live. Neither is settled. But here's what that debate obscures. If the cylinder isn't a rights charter, what it reveals about the Persian Empire is actually more impressive. An empire that controlled somewhere between 44 and 50 million people, roughly 40 to 45% of the world's population, without a centralized police force in most of its territories, without a single official language imposed on its subjects, without demanding that conquered peoples abandon their gods. How do you run something that large? That's the real question. Start with the structure. Darius I, Darius the Great, came to power in 522 BCE after a contested succession and reorganized the empire into roughly 20 to 30 provinces called satrapies. Each satrapy had a governor, a satrap, appointed by the king. But here's what made the system unusual for its time. The satrap governed through local institutions, not over them. Local laws stayed. Local languages stayed. Local religions stayed. Babylonians kept their temples. Egyptians kept their priesthoods. Jewish communities rebuilt their temple in Jerusalem under Persian protection. The empire didn't erase what it absorbed. It taxed it. Tribute was standardized under Darius. Each satrapy paid a fixed annual amount calculated in silver. The Persepolis administrative tablets, thousands of clay records found in the treasury and fortification walls, document workers being paid in rations, grain, wine, livestock. The empire ran on meticulous accounting. Now consider the logistics problem. You're administering territory from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the Indus Valley of modern Pakistan. The empire stretched roughly 5,000 kilometers from one end to the other in 500 BCE. The Persian answer was the Royal Road, a maintained route roughly 2,700 kilometers from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa, the administrative capital. That road covered the western and central core of the empire. Along it, relay stations were placed at regular intervals, each stocked with fresh horses and royal couriers. According to Herodotus, royal dispatches could travel the full length of the royal road in roughly 7 days, a claim scholars consider plausible given the relay system's architecture, though it hasn't been independently verified by archaeological evidence. If accurate, that's about 380 kilometers per day using horse relays. A merchant traveling the same road without relay access would take 3 months. You'll often hear this called the world's first postal system. That's an overstatement. The relay network carried royal dispatches, official government communications. It wasn't open to private citizens sending letters. It was a state intelligence and command network. Impressive, precise, and nothing like your local post office. The economy beneath all of this was equally sophisticated. Darius introduced the daric, a standardized gold coin stamped with the king's image. For the first time, a single currency could move across the entire empire without being reweighed or revalued at each border. Archaeological evidence shows goods from India, Egypt, Greece, and Central Asia all passing through Persian administrative centers. The empire wasn't just a military achievement. It was a trade network with a government attached. So let's go back to the cylinder. With all of that context, the satrapy system, the royal road, the standardized tribute, the document reads differently. Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. The city surrendered without a major battle, a fact that itself requires explanation. Babylon was one of the most fortified cities in the ancient world. The Babylonian king, Nabonidus, had alienated his own priesthood by neglecting the cult of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. Cyrus walked in, and then he did something politically calculated and genuinely unusual. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the chosen servant of Marduk, the god the previous king had neglected. The cylinder records this in the first person. Marduk searched for a righteous ruler. He found Cyrus. He took Cyrus by the hand and called him to lordship. This is the theological argument at the heart of the document, aimed squarely at Babylonian audiences. The acts of tolerance and repatriation follow from this argument. Cyrus returned statues of gods to their original temples. He allowed exiled peoples to go home. He restored sanctuaries that Nabonidus had neglected. Each act is presented as fulfilling Marduk's will, not as a universal principle of human freedom. Does that make the acts less real? No. The Jewish exiles who returned to Jerusalem didn't care about Cyrus's political calculus. They went home. Their temple was rebuilt. Their religious identity survived. The book of Isaiah calls Cyrus the Lord's anointed, the only non-Jewish figure in the Hebrew Bible given that title. But the distinction between a political act of tolerance and a universal declaration of rights matters. One is a king making strategic choices. The other is a civilization articulating a principle. Cyrus did the first. The second is something we projected onto his clay cylinder 2,500 years later, partly because we needed the story. The debate among historians is active and unresolved. Some scholars argue the cylinder's acts of tolerance represent a genuine political philosophy, even if not articulated in the language of rights. Others maintain its standard Mesopotamian royal inscription, distinguished only by the scale of the empire behind it. Both positions have serious scholarly support.
Here's what the evidence actually shows. The Cyrus Cylinder is not the world's first human rights charter. But what it documents is something arguably more interesting: the first large-scale experiment in governing through legitimacy rather than force alone. The Achaemenid Empire lasted 220 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. It absorbed dozens of cultures, languages, and religious traditions, not by erasing them, but by making them economically and administratively legible to a central authority. The cylinder is the most famous artifact of that system, not because it invented rights, but because it shows a king explaining himself to his subjects, justifying his rule, promising continuity. In 539 BCE, that was genuinely unusual. When Alexander's conquest of Persia culminated in the destruction of Persepolis in 330 BCE, he didn't dismantle the satrapy system, he kept it. He adopted Persian court dress. He married Persian noblewomen. He understood what Cyrus and Darius had built well enough to inherit it. That's the real measure of the Achaemenid achievement, not a clay cylinder. The system that outlasted the dynasty. This empire reminds us that the story we tell about a civilization is often the story we need, not the story the evidence supports. The Cyrus Cylinder became a human rights charter in the 20th century because the 20th century needed ancient precedents for universal rights. That's understandable. It's also a distortion. The cylinder is more valuable as what it actually is: evidence of a political system sophisticated enough to govern a substantial share of the ancient world without a common language, a single religion, or a standing army in most of its provinces. We dig into the evidence that contradicts the story you were told, because history is messier than mythology. But when empires fall, their archives burn. The Persepolis treasury tablets survived because they were clay. Most Achaemenid records weren't. What did Darius record? What did Xerxes I order, debate, or revoke that we'll never read because Alexander torched Persepolis in 330 BCE? Which matters more to you, what the cylinder says about Cyrus the Great's political strategy, or what it says about us, that we needed a 2,600-year-old piece of clay to validate a principle we hadn't yet written down ourselves? Stay skeptical of your sources, even the ancient ones.